Okay, so welcome everybody that is here. This is the first day of the Scholars Math presentations. So we're going to have three presenters today presenting the projects they've been working on all trimester that cover a variety of topics that relate to mathematics in some way. So we're going to start off the day with Graham Williams.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming today. Today I'll be talking about how airlines make their money. So let's set up the situation. So British Airways 777 flight from Washington Dulles Airport in America to London Heathrow. The round trip economy ticket at the time the data was taken is $876. There are 122 economy seats on the British Airways Boeing 777. And the pricing for those higher class seats is, first class is $8,715, the business class is $6,723, and the premium economy seats are $2,633. Let's talk about the on-plane pricing. So as you can see, the stuff that's highlighted in blue, that's the economy class. They generate per flight about $106,872. And the yellow is a premium economy, one of the smaller classes. Generates about $105,320. The red is the business class, which generates about $322,704. And the first class, which is at the very front of the plane, $122,010. The 14 passengers at the front of the plane profit the airline more than the 122 seats in the back. And those 45% of passengers make up 84% of the airline's revenue. So let's talk a little bit more about the fares. So the fares for this flight are particularly high because it is a non-stop flight between two high-demand and high-income cities. Those fares drop when they add a stop. So the economy comes down to $392, premium economy comes down to $1,100, $1,150, and the business class comes down to about $3,000. First class still sits at about $5,000. But if let's say if a stop was added, for example, then those prices and revenue would see a significant fall off. Let's talk a little bit about the history of class to give some background. By 1952, airlines had figured out a way to sell the same flight for different prices. So, for instance, one of the earlier occurrences of the system originates when it comes to airline travel, a route from John F. Kennedy Airport in New York. Again, talking about London Heathrow. There were only two classes at the time, the tourist class and the standard class. So the tourist class tickets were purchased for people who were just traveling for desire or going to see London for who knows what reason. The standard class is dedicated more to business people who are corporate and making that trip for business. So that needs a little bit more flexibility. In the 9 years between 1969 and 1978, several changes within the industry had altered. I think one of the biggest ones was the passenger plane, the Boeing 747, which is the one on the top image. The Boeing 747 was was implemented into fleets, and it's one of the bigger planes at the time. The one below it is the Concorde, which is one of the most luxurious and most fast planes. It was also implemented into fleets, and the deregulation of airlines as well gave the ability for them to set their own prices, and they were no longer controlled by the government. So the 747 gave the space to experiment, the Concorde gave the reason to, and the deregulation gave the ability. So first, in terms of first class isolation, a lot of airlines had avoided the first class because of the Concorde, because it was just the prime example of what a first class plane should be, fast and very luxurious. So a lot of the other planes have focused on captivating the economy and business classes or the middle tier customer. Eventually the Concorde failed miserably due to a lot of crashes and malfunctions with its systems. So select airlines slowly started reintroducing that first class, and it sort of shows that the competition of the Concorde had built out a lot of effective middle class systems for the rest of those airlines, and the rest of them are just starting to bring back that first class. The development of classes isn't really about how airlines develop more luxurious seats. It's about how they cut costs to allow more people to fly. So airlines figured out a way to sell the same product for different prices to different people. The selling point still remains the same from point A to point B. The only difference is the on-flight experience within the plane. And one of the questions that I posed myself throughout my research is there a modern day first class experience? And statistics do show that a lot of the cost revenue ratio for first class is skewed, so that which causes more airlines to just focus on their business class. Yeah. So one of the big loyalty programs I want to talk about, and one of the big focuses is the United Airlines loyalty program. So they had to make a big change for the COVID-19 pandemic. They had to start hemorrhaging money in order to stay afloat while the travel ban was going on, because they lost a lot of money during that. So they needed loans from banks, so they had to sort of set out, they had to put up collaterals in case they failed to pay back the loan. And United wasn't really worth much at the time, so they put up something called Mileage Plus Holdings LLC, which is the value, which is a loyalty program that United used. That was one of its subsidiaries, and at the end of the year, the Form 8K had stated that if you multiply Mileage Plus Holdings 2019 EBITDA by a factor of 12, equates to a Mileage Plus valuation of approximately $21.9 billion. So essentially, the value of the airline is less than the loyalty program, and according to Wall Street, the airlines themselves are practically worthless. The only thing imparting each airline with value is its own loyalty program. So loyalty programs, sort of more in depth. The airlines are hardly transportation companies anymore. I know that's what we all think of them as. The crafting of their revenue system makes them willing to lose money flying in order to prop up their frequent flyer programs. The core proposition of these frequent flyer programs is giving away those free flights. These businesses became possible with the deregulation that we had talked about. But American Airlines had established one of the first major loyalty programs, and the Advantage members were more likely to choose American Airlines because they would be able to accumulate points for the free flights by flying with American, which sets up a good example of what a sunk cost fallacy is. So a sunk cost fallacy is our tendency to continue with an endeavor we've invested money, effort, or time into, even if the current costs outweigh the benefits. So one of the loopholes that was recognized, kind of within or as the business developed, was the fact that a traveler who flew from Los Angeles Airport to a Chicago Airport to San Francisco Airport would earn 10 times the points as opposed to flying direct from San Francisco to Los Angeles. The flight would be priced lower, but the point value would be higher because that system was based on miles. This was a terrible system for airlines because they would be losing money on those longer flights, but the customer would be benefiting off of the longer flights because they got more points. So airlines were basically incentivizing against their own interests. So they were providing incentives for something that did not benefit them in the slightest. And thankfully, the system was switched to based on money spent and not miles flown. So the reconstruction of the redemption system overall, formerly any economy class flight on United would cost 12,500 points regardless of the date, despite the cash rates being higher on days like holidays, breaks, or weekends, things like that. The cost per seat on points for certain days was greater than what the airline earned, so the opportunity cost on the highest demand days is huge, and almost every seat is likely to be sold for cash. And each airline now has a dynamic awards chart, so as you can see on the right over here, point redemption rates rise on the high demand days, and the mile rates correlate to the cash rates themselves. The value of miles and points since this system was implemented has risen by about 250%. This is because they can't expose the accumulation of miles for redemption anymore. The whole system has sort of changed, so the only thing putting a check on the power is the exchange rate. The airlines do care about how much a company is willing to pay for points, and how much they're willing to pay for points is based on the public's perception of the airline. So when I was making a formula, I sort of analyzed the other financial systems, or like how other banks or how other airlines had developed their loyalty programs. And I figured that a lot of them were a little bit one-sided and some were within the middle. So a lot of them have benefited the consumer more than the producer and vice versa. So I kind of wanted to develop something that was in between. And like, for example, on the right here, American Airlines, the Advantage program, it has like a tier system. So as you go up within like in miles between each 4,000 points or however many increments it is, you gain more. So it's kind of like a tier system. So this is the math that I put up. So a lot of this revolves around like hypotheticals, but it's pretty typical for what someone would spend. So one of the things I wanted to incorporate into my consumer formula was month values, because I felt that one of the better systems was those days where it's high demand, the airline should be earning more. So I set up some spending limits, so a lot of spending on airline tickets and general spending in hotels and car rentals, because those are all involved with the airline. So yeah, that's like one of the formulas I set up for consumer net benefit. And then producer net profit was that's the original formula that I had. I wasn't too satisfied with it because I felt that it kind of offset, which we can kind of look at here. But the top one is the original producer net profit formula, and as you can see, it's the consumer outweighs it by a lot, which I felt was unbalanced, and it doesn't really speak to what I wanted out of my system itself. So the one below it is the producer net profit maximized. So what I did to maximize it was sort of increase loyalty rewards and what the airline earns, adjusted the rates. So instead of going from that 3-2-1 system, we go back down to 2.5%, 1.5%, and 1%. So the airline is making, or the consumer is making a little bit less, but the airline gets more in return to kind of have that ability to maximize their perks and get more profit out of the system. And then obviously the redemption rate of miles to dollar or points to dollar had to be changed, because that was one of the big things that brought the profit down. And yeah, are there any questions? Mr. Miller?
So what did you do throughout this process when you were developing your formula to test out, to try to get a gauge on how it was going to benefit and how the points shook out in your formula?
So I did a lot of experimenting with like different spending and people in different scenarios. So if there's someone who sort of is a year-round traveler and they're taking flights a lot of times per month, I looked at how that would benefit them, and like sort of looking at different types of consumers to make sure that it was sort of, I guess, had covered more ground, because I felt like I wanted it to be something that made sense for a lot of people. And there's also people who fly less per year, so that's where the general spending and like that sort of thing comes in, because those people should still be able to benefit off of those rewards and that system overall. But yeah.
Can I ask a question? Did you use your formula to evaluate any existing loyalty programs?
Yeah, so I didn't really incorporate it in the presentation, but I had tried out like different different systems. So one of the big ones, the American Airlines one, was one that I used, and sort of seeing how they broke down the math between like if I fly this amount of miles a year, if I spend this much on a credit card a year, what do I get out of it? So that was one of the things that I developed as well, was like sort of thinking about how does my spending translate through different cards? Like what earns me the most benefit? And like one of the things I created was sort of like a shopping spree, or like a general like month, like where I'm spending this much on groceries, or if I'm taking a flight somewhere, like what sort of rewards do I get out of that? Yeah.
So you talked about how most of the models that are currently out there either really benefit the consumer or the producer of this.
Yeah.
Is there a particular reason that you know why most airlines aren't shooting for the middle, kind of like your model has?
Well, because a lot of these airlines are shooting for more the producer side because they're a smaller airline. So flights or airlines like Hawaiian, they have like one of the lower redemption rates in terms of cents and points. So they're trying their best to maximize their profit because they don't really get that much outreach out of their airline themselves. So that's like one of the reasons why they're maximizing. One of the other programs that does sort of lean towards that consumer side is JetBlue. That's what my family flies, and like something that I've noticed is that like they're more beneficial to the consumer than I think I've realized because of the amount of perks that they offer, and they gain a lot of revenue out of their system overall because of how many stops that they offer. So yeah. Ms. Bowen?
I'm curious how you got interested in this topic and if you were able to talk to anyone in airline companies about their
Well, my dad isn't in an airline company, but he has a big interest in airlines. So like he kind of sparked my interest with it. I'm not really sure I guess I was just kind of like thinking about what to do my project on. I was like, I don't really know how airlines make their money because it's a multi-billion-dollar business, and it's like, I guess it's something that I was like really pondering over, and I wanted to be like, I was interested in what they did to sort of develop and like how they even made their money, because I felt like it was like it's so many people, and it's a big population, so it's like, I don't know, it's kind of, that's a good question. Like, I mean, I think it was just like my interest for airlines themselves, and then also like I was curious, so.
Any other questions? Let's thank Graham. And our second presenter of the day is going to be Ringa.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. My name is Rinka, and the title for my math scholar project is Beyond the Campus, How Williston Drives East Hampton Economy. So in my presentation today, I'd like to focus on three main areas. First, I'll talk about quantifying economic impact using input-output analysis. Second, I'll talk about impact of Williston's new policy allowing boarding students to use third-party delivery services. And lastly, I'll talk about impact on local businesses. So, input-output analysis is a macroeconomic analysis based on the interdependencies between economic sectors and industry. It focuses on direct, indirect, and induced impact. And I chose to use this method because it's a commonly used method in similar studies of economic impact, especially in colleges. So before diving into the analysis itself, I want to clarify these three main areas of impact. Direct economic impact measures the dollars that are generated within a geographic region due to the presence of an institution. Indirect economic impact, also known as multiplier effect, includes the respending of dollars within the local economy by vendors, suppliers, and households. And lastly, induced impacts are the bodies stemming from household spending of labor income after removal of taxes, saving, and commuter income. So for my direct impact, or I guess for my research, I categorize it into five main areas: employment, school spending, taxes, donations, and student spending. Before diving in, I'd like to Alright. Before diving in, I'd like to thank Ms. Simon from Business Office for providing me valuable information for first board categories. So with that said, Williston is one of the largest employers in East Hampton with 271 employees last school year and a total payroll of over $13 million. $7 million of that go into local residents. Williston significantly contributes to the local economy through housing and service spending. Williston as school spent $1 million every school year on local for businesses for supply and services. Williston paid around $130,000 for water storage charges and $8,000 in fees and permits last year. The chart shows taxes paid over the last 4 years, with the spike in 2019 to 2020 school year due to construction projects like EMB, which generates substantial revenue for East Hampton. As a nonprofit organization, Williston regularly donates to local organizations contributed $45,000 last year. These donations are increasingly directed towards local initiatives, reinforcing the school's role in supporting community. So now I'd like to dive into the topic of student survey. To gather the data for this, I sent out the survey that you can access from this QR code to random selected group of 158 students, including both boarder and day students. I received responses from 42 boarding students and 42 day students. One of the survey questions I asked was, one of the survey questions I asked for boarder was, how much money do you typically spend each week in East Hampton? The results are displayed on the left side of the screen in the pie chart. And based on the data collected, the mean weekly spending for each boarder came to $45.54. However, because the survey options were represented in $20 ranges, this average could vary between $30.5 to $60.71. Given that the median response fell in $25 to $50 range, it's likely that the mean calculated reasonably close to the actual average spending. So on the right side, right bottom of the screen, you can see the breakdown of the spending figures, the average weekly spending per boarder, the total weekly spending by all boarders, and the total weekly and the projected spending over the entire school year. If each boarder spent $45.54 per week on average, then collectively, boarders contribute about $12,978 each week to East Hampton economy. Over the course of 34 weeks of school year, this would amount over $588,000, highlighting a significant impact from boarders spending alone. One of the survey questions for day student in contrast was, how much money do you typically spend weekly in East Hampton with other Williston students or during academic time? I worded the question in this way to make sure that I'm getting the spending directly related to Williston and not the spending that they would do just because they live around here. As shown in the pie chart, the day students spending significantly less than boarding students with an average weekly spending of $21.43 per day student. However, like with the boarders, survey questions were in $25 increments, so that this average could vary between $8.93 to $39.3. Since the median response was in $0 to $25 range, it's likely that this calculated mean slightly overestimate day students' typical spending. So on the right side, you'll see the breakdown of this data. So if each day student spent $21.43 per week on average, then collectively the day students contribute about $5,870 per week at East Hampton, and over a school year, this would amount over $126,000. However, given that the mean may be slightly overestimated, a more realistic figure of total annual spending by these students is likely to be close around $100,000 or less. To sum up, Williston has significant direct impact on East Hampton economy, contributing over $14 million each year across 5 main areas I study. And that's just the start, because this doesn't include the spending by the visitor, parents, alumni when they come to campus, so which adds up even more to the local economy. So while $14 million is a big part of Williston's impact, it's just the beginning of it. So now for the indirect and induced impacts, the economic multiplier for educational institution is 1.6, meaning every dollar spent in East Hampton generates additional 60 cents for local economic activity. Applying this multiplier, Williston impacts rises over $23 million when indirect and induced effects are considered, showing the significant contribution to East Hampton's economy through both direct spending and broader ripple effect. So now I'd like to shift to second focus on my presentation, impact of the third delivery services. So as many of you may already know, Williston has a new policy allowing boarding students to use services like Uber Eats or DoorDash, and I've seen a lot of students using them, so I wanted to explore what the impact could be. So another question I asked for boarder on the survey I talked about earlier was how have you used third-party delivery services this school year? And 2/3 of them said yes. So for those who had, I included follow-up question to understand their ordering habits. And one of the question was, how often do you order from these services? As you can see on the right side of the screen, students who use these services order around 4.3 times in 10 weeks. So I also asked them, how much do you typically spend per order? So the pie chart shows that the average per order is around $28.62, although this could vary from $18.62 to $38.62 based on survey response ranges. With a median of $20 to $40, this estimate seems fairly accurate. And on the right, we see how much each student spent per trimester, and about $123 on delivery services over 10 weeks. Multiplying by 190 students, or 2/3 of the boarding population, the total trimester spending comes to around $23,465. However, I do believe this may underestimate actual spending. I've seen a lot of boarders using these services far over 4 times. And I think one of the reasons that this happened is that I took this survey earlier in the trimester, and students started to use these services as the trimester progressed. So Chipotle, Popeyes, Taco Bell, Starbucks, and McDonald's are some of the most popular places for students to use these services. And for each order, restaurants keep around 70 to 80% of the revenue. So based on the survey, we can estimate that change Reddit receives around $17,598 in revenue from Williston students. These trends could potentially reduce profit opportunity for local nearby businesses like Antonio. And I had hoped to interview Antonio manager and to understand any impact on their businesses because of this new policy, but I wasn't able to get any insights for that. And so for the impact for the DoorDash drivers, each delivery orders earn, for each delivery, DoorDash drivers earns from $2 to $10. Over a 10 weeks period, Williston students placed around 770 orders, at least from what I got in the survey. So this could translate to additional $1,540 to $7,700 in their earnings. So lastly, I would like to talk about impact of local businesses. I went around East Hampton to contact with managers from various local businesses, and the manager from Tandem, Veracruzana, and Pokeball gave me some great insights, so I'd like to share some here. So for Tandem, for the month of April 2024, there was 305 orders with Sammy Card. Then the average order was $9.78. This was 1 to 2% of the revenue Tandem had that month. However, the overall impact of Williston students is much larger when we consider faculties, staff, families, other visitors, and as well as students paying through their personal card or with cash. And the manager said in total, Williston's influence is estimated to be between 6 to 8% of their annual revenue. They also see some seasonal trends in businesses. So during the March break, there's slight decrease in sales due to the absence of students, but in the holiday season or in summer, the sales either remain the same or even increase due to the public school vacation and bike trail. For Pokeball, 3% of their revenue also came from Sammy Card in 2023. Also, the manager mentioned that the store tends to get quieter over the summer with students' absence. At Veracruzana, about 1% of their revenue came from Williston students, and the manager said the Williston students' order is around $20 on average. So to summarize, Williston plays a significant role in driving the local economy through direct spending, employment, donations, students' expenditures, and more. However, the shift towards using third-party delivery services challenge for local presents both opportunity and challenges for local businesses. So while it generates additional revenue for larger chains, it may also be limiting profit for opportunity for smaller locally owned business in East Hampton. As we've seen from the data, Williston impact on East Hampton is substantial, but it's crucial for both school and the community to consider how emerging trends and policy will affect the long-term health of the local businesses. So thank you for your attention, and if there's any questions.
So the indirect impact, you talked about a multiplier. I'm assuming that's kind of a general, like, accepted one for educational services. Do you know what different things are kind of baked into that 1.6 multiplier?
So this multiplier is the one for four-year college institution, but I don't think this is the right answer, but I think it is that let's say Mr. Maley, you received the salary leave from Williston, and I think what it's saying is that you would spend that if your salary increased by $100, you would spend additional $60 for something else in local businesses, or you would spend locally, and 40% would go to somewhere else, like saving or anything else. I think that's where the 60 is coming from, or I guess the 0.6 is coming from.
When you talk to the local business managers, do they have any other insights about the impact of being in a school community like this?
So the tenant manager said that there's actually a lot that come on Wednesday and Saturdays, which is not surprising. I order mostly on Wednesday and Saturday as well. So I think that's one thing. This is not what they said, but one thing that I noticed was that when I just walked into those restaurants and just asked them oh, I'm doing this for my math scholar project, they were really friendly, just gave me their numbers and email address. So I think that's one thing, that being in a community with big boarding school, I think they're sort of used to having students around. So I think that's one thing.
You focused just on the restaurants in town. I'm curious, did you ever think to talk to the thrift stores or the other stores down on Cottage Street?
I sort of realized that last minute, but I focused mainly on the restaurant just because that's where I spend most of my money, and I'm in East Hampton. But I would say if I had another month or so, I would definitely go ask through those businesses as well.
The revenue estimates you got from both Kokomo and Veracruzana, were those based just on Sammy Card data? I know with Tandem One, you had the Sammy Card, but then what they actually estimated? I was just curious about that.
So for Pokeball, the 3%, I think it's 3%, was coming from their data. It shows that the manager sent me the graph of it, and it says a certain percent of it is coming from credit cards, a certain percent is coming from the DoorDash, and it says the 30% were coming from the Sammy Card. So that's it only counts the Sammy Card cards. So I'm pretty sure there's a lot more that Williston actually contributes. And for Veracruzana, I'm honestly not sure where the 1% came from. That's what the manager said, but there was no actual the graph or data or any sort of thing that he sent with that 1%, with the number. So I'm not exactly sure where it came from.
Any other questions? Let's thank Rick again. be Carter.
All right. Hi everybody, my name is Carter Cleary, and for my Math Scholars project this trimester, I put together my passions for politics, statistics, and filmmaking to see what the effects of micro-targeting and the American Privacy Rights Act will be on digital consumers. So what is micro-targeting? Micro-targeting is pretty much what social media companies use your phones for to make money off you. Your phone and Instagram on it, TikTok on it aren't, their primary purpose isn't to entertain you, but rather to collect data. If you look at the agreements when you sign up for these apps, they have access to your texts, they can record your audio, they can see your photos. And what they do with this information is they create psychological profiles of you, and they then sell that data to other companies, political consultancies, companies looking to put ads on consumers. So those ads can then see who's going to be most efficient for putting an ad, who can I sell to, who can I convince. And recently, Congress has had a lot of hearings with Mark Zuckerberg, how data has been used from Meta to influence consumers and if this is ethical. Okay, so a fairly recent example of this was the Cambridge Analytica scandal in the 2016 presidential election. The Trump campaign reached out to this big political consultancy in London led by Alexander Nix, and he wanted to convince voters to vote for him. So Alexander Nix legally but unethically took 87 million Facebook users' data and was able to harvest 5,000 points of data per user. He had a team of data scientists and a team of creative directors who were making ads to convince people. This caused a whole mess with the Federal Trade Commission, and he ended up getting banned from serving as an executive in England for 7 years. And so Congress has had some response to this hearings, and right now going through Congress is the American Privacy Rights Act. So the American Privacy Rights Act is a bill, bipartisan bill, and what it will do is pretty much severely restrict the data companies can harvest from you and sell to others. Right now, for example, I read a story the other day about how companies knew your belt size data and they were using that to target you with certain food ads or clothing ads. So this bill would allow consumers to opt out of data harvesting like that without being retaliated against, meaning you could click the opt out of data harvesting button on Instagram and Instagram wouldn't be able to take away features from you. One thing that would still be allowed to be collected under the American Privacy Rights Act is non-precise geolocation data. So before the American Privacy Rights Act, meaning right now, companies know what room in your house you wake up in, what cubicle you work in at work. With the American Privacy Rights Act, that would be severely restricted, and they just know your zip code, your town, if you're rural, urban, or suburban, what county you're in. So all of that took me to my guiding question, which was, can geolocation data be used to effectively micro-target and convince U.S. voters, or will the American Privacy Rights Act actually be effective, and is geolocation data not sufficient to predict how a voter will react to political messaging? So my experiment was, I initially, with the help of my parents, my grandparents, and my aunt, I recruited participants to take the survey and be exposed to an ad on a sample issue. I ended up getting 87 participants. I think there were 67 suburban participants, and I struggled with the urban and rural numbers. But regardless, I went ahead with the survey. I think I took about 12 data points per person. For example, like political ideologies, sex, race, how many kids they had, income, etc. And so once I had the people recruited, I blocked them by their geographic demographics, meaning I had a block of rural voters, a block of suburban voters, and a block of urban voters. With those blocks, I randomized them into treatment groups, and one treatment group would receive an ad for an issue, and the other treatment group would receive an ad against the issue. And I wanted to see how these different geographic demographics would respond to messaging. So my sample issue, this has nothing to do with the American Privacy Rights Act, it was just a dummy issue I chose to analyze how political messaging would come across, was the Kids Online Safety Act. It's a bipartisan bill going through Congress right now that will pretty much just restrict content that minors can see on social media and on the internet. The funny thing about this bill and why I chose it is partly because opponents of it come from very liberal groups and very conservative groups. One concern is parental rights and governments taking away the parents' control of what their kids can see. And the other concern is LGBTQ youth's rights and having access to resources online. So I'll now show you the ads that the participants watched. They were all 15 seconds. I shot them with my brother in his room. So this is the ad that the group that was randomized to see an ad in favor of the app saw.
The most dangerous things impacting our children.
We didn't do enough to prevent these tools from being used to harm as well.
And bad.
Social media is what they all want to be involved in.
Sex, drugs, violence
Can become a problem.
So that was my ad in favor of the Kids Online Safety Act, and here's the ad that was in opposition to it.
Content restricted. Content restricted. Content restricted.
So yeah, that was those were the ads that people saw. I got some pretty good feedback. I had a fun time creating them. And so now I'll talk you through the demographic trends I saw. Who were my people? Who were the participants in the survey? Because it's important to note that any analysis, any conclusions that come from this study can only be generalized to a group like this. So some key takeaways: it was heavily female, 68%. The average income was $209,000 per year for a household. So very wealthy sample. Super majority white, super majority heterosexual, and overall very liberal and heavy Democratic. It was, I think, about 15% independent voters, 74% Democratic voters, and 5% Republican voters. And then when you get into political ideologies, which I took, it was extremely socially liberal. And when you got to the fiscal side of things, there were more fiscal conservatives than social conservatives, but still overwhelmingly fiscally liberal. So that's just something to keep in mind when we look at some possible correlations in data, how people were thinking, and also just when we're generalizing the results, and they can only be applied to a population like this. So yeah, here's my analysis. I started off with chi-square tests for goodness of fit. Because of the sample size and not getting a huge sample, I was only able to do this test, and you have to be cautious with this test because I wasn't able to fill all the conditions to carry it out, but I was able to do it for suburban voters. So V1 right here notates, this is the group that received the ad in favor of the Kids Online Safety Act. And pretty much what chi-square goodness of fit is saying is, I took their opinion on the act before watching the ad, and then you make an expected distribution assuming that the ad doesn't change anything. And what I saw with the p-values here pretty much saying what is the chance that the distribution after watching the ad is a stroke of luck and the true distribution actually is the same as the prior distribution, was 0.0044, meaning that it's almost certain that the ad changed their opinion. For the group that saw the ad opposed to the Kids Online Safety Act, the p-value was even lower, almost 0. And I think this was because, as you can see with the pre-ad opinions, people were much more in favor of the act before seeing it, but when they were exposed to some of the concerns about freedom of speech with the act, they started heavily skewing against it, especially because of the socially liberal trend in the data, or in the participants. So then I went on to non-suburban observations, and because I only had about 10 rural participants and 10 urban participants, I had to combine these groups, which might seem weird because rural is typically more conservative, urban is more liberal. But because this wasn't a super partisan issue, I thought it would be okay to go ahead with this, and especially because these groups are often harder to convince than the suburban voters we saw were a big factor in this most recent election. So I combined those, and because of the small sample size, I wasn't able to carry out a chi-square goodness fit test, but I did see some trends in the data. And those trends said it was about as difficult to sway these voters in favor of the act, but when it came to swaying these voters in opposition to the act, it was more difficult than with suburban voters. So the second part of my statistical analysis was multivariate predictive models. It's also known as multiple linear regression. And pretty much what this is you quantize your data. For example, I had plugged into Excel females as zeros, males as ones, and what you do is you plug this into Excel and you take all your data and you have your dependent variable, which is will they be in favor of the Kids Online Safety Act or will they be in opposition to it, in favor being signified with a 1, opposed opposed to it being signified with 0. And it spits out this model with coefficients. It looks something like this, which is a headache to look at if you've never seen it before. But I'm going to try to break it down for you. So what my model said, this is all the data, so every single geographic group. There wasn't a high R-squared, which I'll start with first. R-squared, also known as the coefficient of determination, is pretty much saying, in our case, about 20% of the variation in people's responses to ad is accounted for by the data here. So obviously there's a lot more data points and psychological factors affecting how these people feel about the Kids Online Safety Act, besides from what I have here. The only significant t-stat, pretty much, which denotes which variable here actually can be used to predict people's opinions on the act, was which type of ad they saw, which was nice to see that my ads worked, but it was kind of disappointing to see that other data points weren't able to predict. So we saw here with the pro versus anti-ad, we had t-stat over 2, which means it's usually acceptable to have confidence that you can use that to predict how somebody will feel about the ad. We also saw that geography was more important than the political lean of a state. To quantize where people were coming from, I calculated the probability of randomly selecting a Democrat from their state. Massachusetts is about 0.33, for example. The average of the sample was, I think, 42%, and that's how I quantized that. And that was actually less significant than if somebody was rural, urban, or suburban. But nonetheless, that proved to be noise, which we'll see especially later. When I broke this down just with the suburban voters and how they acted, there was a higher R-squared, meaning the data can explain more of the variation with suburban voters. And we also saw that for suburban voters, age, especially political ideologies, had higher associations. And I guess now I'll also introduce you to what coefficients mean in this table. If we see here with income, we have a negative number, super small. It's not super significant with a t-stat of only about -1. But what this coefficient means is that for every $1,000 increase in income for a participant, the model predicts that they will be, was that 0.06% less likely to be in favor of the Kids Online Safety Act. So that's what the trends we saw for the suburban voters. When I took this to non-suburban voters, they had a higher R-squared, almost 40%. But this was likely can be attributed to lack of diversity. I don't think there were any non-white people in this block. So I disregarded the R-squared. And that's one of the challenges when you are working with a small sample. I also saw for non-suburban voters that income and religion had higher associations than for suburban voters. However, everything for non-suburban voters was statistically insignificant, meaning that with the data that I pulled in the model that was created, you can't actually confidently predict how the non-suburban voters will react, even when you're factoring in which ad they saw. So that takes us to our conclusions, and just remember all conclusions have to be generalized to a mostly northeastern, white, female-heavy, wealthy, heterosexual, liberal group of people. So the first conclusion was that the ads had a greater effect on suburban voters, and that non-suburban voters' opinions were harder to manipulate and predict. And so pretty much what that's telling us and how this could be applied is that if a political consultancy is looking to convince a group of voters, it might be a more effective use of advertising dollars to send out ads to suburban voters than to non-suburban voters. The second conclusion I found was that geographic data had a low t-stat and that thus provides me noise in the data, meaning that when you factor in if somebody is non-suburban or they're suburban, you can't really use that to predict how they'll act, and that means that the American Privacy Rights Act restricting data to just that point will be effective in protecting consumers from manipulation. And lastly, I also found that political ideologies and income were the most valuable data for predicting how voters would react. Potential errors come in not all conditions being met due to a small sample size, and also there's this thing called type 1 errors in statistics where you think something is statistically significant, but it's actually not. And what I changed for next time, I'd like a larger, more diverse sample. Typically when they're doing political polling, they take about 1,000 people to get a valid sample. I only had about 87. I'd also want to collect more political data points and work with maybe some kids in psych class to see on how people process information, different types of advertisements. And I'd also want to, when I'm adding more questions, I want to take more complex ways of quantizing the data, maybe with Likert scales, which are pretty much those things you see on surveys, which are how likely are you to support this on a scale of 1 to 10? That's a Likert scale. And I'd also want to try out a more divisive sample issue next time, maybe a mock candidate, or taking a national hardline issue to parse out where things become statistically significant and convincing people. So yeah, that was my experiment, and I now have a little bit of time for questions, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah.
Ms. Fuller.
So with your ads, I'm wondering if you found anything out there about how you can quantify the sort of quality of the ad. Like one was much more sort of fear-based, and the other was a little softer.
Yeah. So what I was looking at, I've done research on how political messaging can be used against certain groups and like the psychology of conservatives versus liberals. And it was saying that often fear-based ads work a lot better amongst conservatives, which is kind of a swing and a miss given the huge liberal slant in my sample. However, it was still saying, especially for this act, liberals usually gravitate more towards ads that boost unity and hope. But because of the nature of this ad and not really being able to put that in that perspective, that's the way I had to go with the ad. I also took a lot of inspiration from this movie on Netflix. It's really good. It's called The Social Dilemma, and it talks about how algorithms can be used to like politically polarize and radicalize people. And I took a lot of frames from there. I initially had them in the slideshow, but I didn't have time to show them all. But that was kind of the same vibe in lighting techniques and editing techniques and VFX that they were using that I borrowed for mine. Olin?
You said that the Registration and Privacy Act wouldn't allow users to opt out of geolocation. Do you know why that is? Why that's not part of it?
I'm not sure why that is not still protected. It's mostly, it was, as I said, it's like non-precise, so it's just using Wi-Fi triangulation to see what town you're in. But I'm not sure why that would still be allowed while something like race or gender would not be.
You said there was both opposition and support for this bill from sort of both sides of the aisle, but it's interesting, if I understood you right, that income sort of tracked with opposition to it. Did you give any thought as to what that connection is?
My thought was that generally, as income increases, a person's likelihood to be fiscally conservative also increases. And with fiscal conservatism comes this view of the government favoring a more laissez-faire method of government, less regulation, and that a government regulation saying what companies can and cannot collect would be then less favorable for somebody who's fiscally conservative. So that's, I thought about that a lot when I was seeing why that coefficient was negative. Mr. Naylor.
I know we talked a lot in like the last few days about the multi-variable linear regression and different things to try to fit the data to it. Did you get a chance to experiment when you only use the kind of truly quantitative values of the model as opposed to everything?
Yeah, so I originally had a slide that was only numerical data, which was age, income, the probability of randomly selecting a Democrat from a participant state. And if I recall correctly, the R-squared value was higher than for all the data, meaning that those numerical data points do a little bit of a better job explaining how people react to the ads rather than their race, gender, etc. categorical data. But still, it was nowhere near, in financial modeling, for example, they have a standard about 85% R-squared value for a model to be valid and statistically significant. So I'd like to try to find out more ways to quantize that, maybe with Likert scales, like I was saying. But it didn't do a whole lot in being better at predicting behavior.
Any other questions for Carter? Yeah, thank you.